And it's a great pleasure to host this event, which is co-organized by the Kiesler Foundation in Vienna and the University of Applied Arts, also in Vienna. And it's a great pleasure because, of course, this year we are commemorating the 50th year of the death of Frederick Kiesler. And there has been quite a number of events that reflect how his influence continues to affect the work of both artists and architects, but also scholars and curators. And the book that is being presented today precisely reflects that expanded interest and the fact that so much speculation continues to happen. I would say precisely because Kiesler also wanted to keep an open-ended nature to his work and to his designs. In fact, for me, the inspiration of the Endless House in doing the show here at MoMA was precisely to consider it a trigger, and in that aspect, of course, an homage to Kiesler and this project, but a trigger to think about how his ideas of the single-family dwelling as a place of encounter of the different arts, I think continues to bear quite an importance. And I hope the show upstairs pays that homage to Kiesler and this Endless House project. So I'm going to be very brief, and I would like to introduce Gerald Bast, the president of the University of Applied Arts in Vienna, who will present a little bit more of the nature and the idea of this panel, and will describe a little bit more about this initiative. So thank you again for being here, and I hope you enjoy the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Pedro. Thank you all for coming. Welcome from my side on behalf of the University of Applied Arts. Well, the reason you might think it's quite unusual for a president of a university to come to an event just focused on architecture with a lot of people from the architecture scene. The reason actually why I came here is that I think Frederick Kiesler is not only important for architecture. Of course, he is an important person for architecture. Actually, I wished that much more architects would read Kiesler and even more would understand what he meant. For example, when he wrote thus, architecture in the future will not be judged chiefly by its beauty of rhythm, juxtaposition of materials, contemporary style, etc. It can only be judged by its power to maintain and enhance man's well-being, physical and mental. Architecture thus becomes a tool for control of man's health. And he demanded architecture to be a socially constructive factor in man's daily activities. Of course, he is very important for architecture in our times. But not only for architecture. In the 1930s, for example, nobody outside of the small group of physicists talked about quantum physics, about Heisenberg's theory of uncertainty, telling us that we cannot define the place and the momentum of a particle at the same time. But Kiesler already wrote, everything which man uses in his struggle for existence is a tool, as such, part of a man-made technological environment, from shirts to shelter, from cannons to poetry, from telephones to painting. No tool exists in isolation. In this sense, Kiesler is of tremendous topicality, not only for architecture, but for the future of our entire society, I think. And in particular, and this is my interest, my special interest, for the future of education. We live in a society where everyone tells us this society is so complex. Everything is connected with everything. Everything has relations to a lot of things. And what are we doing? We're still living in little boxes. And this is what Kiesler wanted to fight with a theory on Correalism. And I understand Kiesler and his endless house not as a vision of form, not as a vision of space, but as a vision of human existence, as a vision how we could and should live, and that we have to at least try to combine things, to combine disciplines. In this complexity, we have to live. And this is why I am interested in Kiesler so much. This is why Kiesler is so important for a university like the University of Applied Arts, which is dealing with art, design, and architecture, or rather the future of art, design, and architecture. And this future must be a future of combining things rather than increasing just the number and the amount of knowledge. Combining the knowledge is at least as important in our times than as increasing the knowledge. And this is why I'm so proud of this book, which is, I think, programmatically entitled Endless Kiesler and not Kiesler's Endless House. And I want to thank Klaus Bollinger, the head of our Institute of Architecture. Thanks to Florian Medicus, who will chair the discussion now, architect, theorist, teacher, and researcher at the University of Applied Arts. Thanks to the Austrian Frederick and Lillian Kiesler Foundation, today represented by Gerd Zillner. Thanks to Christine Moser, the head of the Austrian Cultural Forum in New York, who again supported us and our activities here in New York. And last but not least, thanks to Pedro Gadanho and to all people at the Museum of Modern Arts in New York who made this possible. Thank you, and I wish you an interesting afternoon. And after the discussion, you have the opportunity to buy this book outside. A wonderful book with a lot of interesting articles, chapters by the major people who are researching and thinking about Kiesler. For example, Hani, Rashid, Klaus Bollinger, Jill Meissner, Laura McGuire, Gerd Zillner, Florian Medicus, Sanford Quinter, Pedro Gadanho, Frederick Kiesler himself. We got the permission to print 2 articles of him. Arne Hoffmann And we have some examples, as this book is the output partly of a one-year seminar at the University of Applied Arts. You can also see some works students did on Kiesler. And we have artistic contributions inside by Asymptote Architecture, Judith Berry, Olafur Eliasson, Heidulf Gergros, Hans Holland, Ian Klar, Jürgen Meyer-Haar, Bruce Naumann, Smiljan Radic, Thomas Saraceno, Andreas Zittel, und Heimat Sobernik, the who is who of architecture. Thank you for coming and enjoy the discussion.
Well, thank you, as you already said, Gerald, for coming. And it's so thrilling and so exciting for us to do this book presentation here at the Museum of Modern Art. For the museum played such a huge role in the history of the project of the Endless House. And after all this work that we've been doing with the book over the last almost 1.5 years, I'm really proud that we're now entering the kind of enjoyable part of this. First of all, I'd like to introduce the panel. Afterwards, I'd like to say a couple of words why we did it and on Frederick Kiesler and his appearance here in New York. We have Mark Wigley, well-known architect, author, editor, and the former dean of the Columbia University's Graduate School of Architecture. Next to him is Juliet Kinchin, curator of the Department of Architecture and Design here at the Museum of Modern Art, and a distinctive specialist when it comes to, how did you say that? History of design and material culture. In the middle, it's Hani Rashid. I believe you all know he's design principal and a co-founder of Asymptote Architecture, and is professor at the University of Applied Arts, and since 2013, president of the Vienna-based Frederick and Lillian Kiesler Private Foundation. Juliet and is accompanied by, thankfully, you're coming here. Laura McGuire, she's been researching and publishing extensively over the last couple of years on Frederick Kiesler, and is now a visiting assistant professor at Virginia Tech in Blacksburg. Why we're so happy that we're here is not only for this relevance and this clear relation that Kiesler had with the museum, and especially when it comes to that project that should have been built outside in the museum's garden. The pool is still there. But as we all know, it never got erected for several reasons. We will not discuss the reasons why it got not erected, but this is probably something that you can read in the book. What makes it even more thrilling is that we believed in the first discussions, if we're doing this book, that there's a huge impact still on contemporary architecture when it comes to Kiesler's theories on co-realism and the magic architecture, which is a special field of Gerd Zillner, who will be doing the final note. And yeah, let's probably get into it. And I believe, Mark, you were up in the exhibition and saw these fantastic drawings and the model. Yes. And this will be the first set, and I'd ask all the panel to do a kind of inaugural statement on Kiesler. Thank you.
Well, you know, as the least informed, it's a good way to start, because start at the bottom. I mean, I like the book. It has this kind of reptilian cover, and you know, I think of reptiles as coming from a previous time of the planet. You know, so I think it's a good kind of image. It's not just the surface of the house, of course, but it implies this house could be much older than Kiesler. And I think when we are talking about architects or artists, but in the case of Kiesler, it is always, you know, both and more. We tend to say, okay, there's the architect and there's their project, and we listen to their explanation of the project and so on. But it many times is probably the most interesting work is the project is really in control, and the so-called designer is trying to just ride it like an animal. And it's possible that the Endless House was such a project. We can find it doesn't even, it comes kind of quite late even in the trajectory of Kiesler, and just as almost everything Kiesler does is connected to work being done by other people, some of the thoughts in the Endless House are also coming from a kind of deeper history. So it's not so much that he invents the Endless House, but he starts to become part of the Endless House itself. And I think this is almost always true of architecture, and it's almost always better to see in which way is a house influencing its architect than the other way around. But in this case, it's even more important because precisely what he's interested in is the inability to separate yourself from objects and so on. So not just that it's like a body, but that it is a body. So it's possible to imagine that the Endless House comes from before some swamp earlier on, and he starts to ride it at a certain point and never stops riding it, and it would be then not so important that he's no longer alive. In other words, this thing will kind of keep going, and maybe that's what this book is doing and what the foundation is doing and so on. And I think if you were to sort of measure Kiesler, who was occupying many different sites, many different theaters, he probably would appear to be alive because of the work of the foundation and the scholars that are writing. You know, he's probably occupying the same amount of the discourse that he was when he was alive. And why am I saying all this? Because therein, I think, lies the special attraction of this particular project, the Endless House, is that so many of us theorists or designers, could imagine that we were the ones in a relationship with this project. And when it's written about by other people, you cannot help but be seduced. And it would be seduction, since he says not only is architecture just like the human body, but specifically like a female body, and then describes that relationship. So there is a course in sort of super sexualized language of Kiesler. But what I find truly remarkable is in one of those two texts that you publish is his brilliant observation that not only should the house house you and your guests, and he gives a kind of description of hospitality, like how to take care of the visitors to your house. He also speaks about the need of how the house needs to take care of the things inside your psyche, which he says. So he says, the Endless cannot be only a home for the family, but must definitely make room and comfort for those visitors from your own inner world. So there's the visitors that come from the outside, and then there's the visitors that come from your psyche. Again, if it was endless, it would only be endless if there were more or less the same amount of visitors from the outside as from the inside, to such an extent that no longer would there be any kind of line between inside and outside, and a house would not be the drawing of a line. The classical image of a house is, of course, a line that defines an interior. In the case of the Endless House, it would be precisely the lack of a line and a kind of folding that would allow the visitors from the outside and the visitors from the inside to, as it were, meet, not in a space exactly, but in a kind of blurring of the line, right? If I understand the Endless House. So to keep going, communion and comfort from those visitors, and he puts visitors in italics, just in case we don't realize that. Truthfully, the inhabitants of your inner space are steady companions, although invisible to the naked eye, but very much felt by the psyche. And of course, Vienna, it's as if we think that people only started to get weird after Freud, like the unconscious arrives with him. But certainly, Viennese are more comfortable about talking about their inner companions. Read the letters of Neutra from Japan to his wife. I mean, you sort of want to say, we don't need to know that. So he goes on, these invisible guests are the secret servicemen and honor guard of your being. We cannot treat them as burglars. We cannot make them feel we must make them feel comfortable. They represent diligently the echoes of your past life and the projection of a promised or hopeful realm of the time to come. So I think, and if we take even the simplest thought, that when you make a house, you must make a house also for the psychological inner beings of each person that occupies the house. So a house for the invisible, such an important responsibility, it would seem to me. But those things from the invisible may have come from a past life and may project a promised or hopeful time to come. So again, even Kiesler, because he speaks here of his own demons, obviously, his own inner beings, that they came like the reptile from some earlier moment. And so I think, again, of course, this is a very poetic statement about, and again, it is another way of talking about correalism, but in terms of time, not in terms of space. And I just think, again, in so many ways, what Kiesler says and what Kiesler continues to do renders most people in the architectural community utterly boring. And I think the reason why it's good to make another book about Kiesler is just to remind us of just how dull most people in our field can be, and how important it is to have, how wonderful that house was not built, as was in the garden, as was not the house of Buckminster Fuller, and those two houses exhibited here side by side in 1952, when both were planned to be built in the garden, both not built. Why? Because the people, Kiesler and Fuller, were absolutely not boring enough.
Well, following on from that, I suppose my first observation is that to me Kiesler's a quintessential MoMA character artist, in that his interdisciplinary practice just fits the ethos of this whole institution, which is about collapsing boundaries between theatre, graphics, furniture, interiors, lighting, sculpture, photography. And I think also that personally he was just so networked to so many other MoMA mainstays, not just other architectural contemporaries like Buckminster Fuller, but to Duchamp and Rauschenberg and Jasper Johns. And for me also, as for Pedro, I think he becomes a handle for looking both backwards and forwards to design and architecture and other art forms in the collection. One could go back to Herman Finsterland's wonderful model, the Studies for a House of Sociability of about 1920, or Bruno Taut's prismatic architectural forms, and of course Bucky Fuller. And this ties in so well with the organic turn, the organic design competition held here in MoMA in 1940, and with the whole ethos of Russell Wright's Manitoga house completed about 1960, and Burle Marx, but then also forward to the likes of Hausrucker, and from the Mind Expander helmet to the cosmos contained in a jar, which is part of Pedro's exhibition, and to Vito Acconci. When I was curating the exhibition Century of the Child, Growing by Design, I did work with Vito Acconci on the idea of possibly in the garden, again, creating a full-scale version of his Klein Bottle playground. In fact, in the end, we only included it in a model form, but like the theoretical concept that it embodied, of the Klein bottle, this idea of the passage from outside to inside as a continuous surface. And I was also thinking of a more recent acquisition of photographs of Peter Zumthor's chapel by Helene Binet, and the way in which her photography captures the phenomenon that happened because the architecture is built in a particular way. And like Kiesler himself, so sensitive to light as a medium of photography, as well as a means, obviously, of sculpting interior space. But I'm very much someone looking at architecture from the inside out. My main focus is on design and material culture. So this idea of Kiesler of design emanating from observation of life processes is one that is so familiar to me, and I think he exemplifies that idea of the richness of domestic space as territory for such a range of practitioners, and domestic space as this very unstable artifact of artifacts with no one fixed vantage point or no definitive experience created for the inhabitants. And in that sense, I love the way Kiesler fits, or the Endless House in particular, fits into that post-war anthropological turn, particularly in design practice and criticism, and these user-centric conceptions of space and psychospace, and the whole development of environmental psychology at this time. And of course, the publication of Bachelard's Poetics of Space, La Poétique de l'Espace, in 1958, the burrow, the nest, the phenomenology of lived experience. And Edward Hall's concepts of proxemics and the people's use of space as this specialized elaboration of culture. These are ideas which seem to resonate through the Endless House. And for me also, it resonates with the whole cycle of poems by W.H. Auden at the same time about the house, which capture beautifully that sense of psycho-space. So, key words or concepts which I'm sure we'll come back to, the manipulation of lighting, this incredible sense of the materiality of architecture and space, and the way he designs around movement and allows for us to truly perform imaginatively or physically, to perform the spaces we inhabit. So those are the things that strike me so forcibly about Kiesler.
Thank you. Hani? I have an interesting lecture on this USB chip, if you'd like to see it. That's the lecture. When I think about Kiesler, and part of the reason why I became involved with the foundation and think of the legacy, it sometimes, I guess I would use this sort of trite imagery of the sea and the fog, because somehow Kiesler is a kind of beacon, a kind of lighthouse out there. which spins at some strange rate. And once in a while, that beam of light shoots across the boring landscape of our discipline and kind of strikes you in the face. And you pay attention if you're awake. And then it sort of disappears again. And I think the profound thing about Kiesler's Endless House is that it was called endless, and that there was no sort of finite resolution or commodification or commercialization or completion in sight for him. There's a great slide on this USB chip of of Kiesler building his house from the inside out, sitting in his strange sort of mystical robe with a cap on and kind of working inside a sort of what looks like a kind of bubble. And I thought about that image, and I thought, what did he do in New York other than live inside of the creation of this remarkably visionary and avant-garde project? And I think, I read in the Kiesler Foundation papers somewhere that he had spent a lot of time with Marcel Duchamp. And I think, I imagine sometimes my friend Oren Safdie, Moshe Safdie's son, who does plays on architects, I always wonder, I've written him a couple of emails saying you should do a play on Kiesler. And you should call it, the Sunday Chat, what Marcel Duchamp and Kiesler must have touched on once in a while. And I imagine a dialogue a little bit like this, like, Duchamp says in his indelible way, and I'm not going to try and imitate him because I don't know. I'm playing a lot of chess. I'm not doing anything at the moment in the back room, even though you might think I am. And I'm protecting myself from the elements, right? And I wonder if Kiesler thought, and what's your protect? I mean, I'm not a playwright, so don't go with this, but that and then the Armut urinal showing up here, right, and showing up in an exhibition in Paris, was a kind of protective, I think, a kind of antidote or a kind of protective mechanism for Duchamp's own legacy, and in fact has acted that way ever since, and has been another kind of beacon, I suppose, in that sea for artists. And I think, Kiesler recoiled into the idea of building a protective vessel, that the Endless House, and I don't mean protective in the sense of a house protecting you from the elements or from the neighbors or from the sort of outside forces, but protecting the psyche, a little bit the corollary to André Breton's Glass House, a kind of a place in which would persevere through almost everything. And it's interesting when you look at it from that perspective, and once in a while you pay attention to the house, it makes sense that it wasn't completed. It makes sense that this hall is not packed, actually, and that the name Kiesler doesn't resonate in a populist sense, and it's something I'm sure Kiesler would never have ever wanted, that his legacy would become the subject of style or the subject of marketing. But in a way, the resistance, the constant resistance within the work is what's so fascinating. If you read that television interview, I guess, it's amazing to listen to someone who's so resolute on resisting and not giving in. Even though there's a yearning for it, there's that terrific story of him getting a client in California who said he wants to build Endless House, and Kiesler getting on the plane and heading over and finding himself at breakfast with the client and anticipating the building of his house, finally his dream realized as an actual house. And the client took him out to the desert and showed him this expansive desert and said, "So I want your houses here." And he said, "What do you mean houses?" He said, "Well, I want you to build endless houses across this entire landscape." And Kiesler became so depressed, supposedly came back to New York and just kind of even recoiled further. So I think that, if I think about the work and the more it unravels, the more we read into him, the more we look at his legacy. The influences are extraordinary. One of the things that struck me about thinking about Kiesler's time was also the work going on in other disciplines, from Hans Arp in sculpture or Henry Moore, over to the sort of fascinating works that have led all the way up to people like today Eliasson and others who owe a lot to Kiesler. I think that's the fascinating thing about the story of Kiesler, is the building of resistance within the idea of the Endless House. So if you look at the Endless House as as a vehicle of resistance. It kind of gives us hope as architects, I think, once in a while when that light strikes, that regardless of what clients or business or economies or politics or all other trends push us, there is this ability to think about someone like Kiesler doing serious, high-end, deep research in our discipline and pay attention to that again. So.
There, okay. These have all been really great comments, and as someone who's been now working on this fellow, Kiesler, for approximately 10 years, there's a lot that I could talk about. So trying to kind of boil things down into a few more straightforward points is a little challenging, but I think one of the things that has struck me in these many years of trying to figure this man out is that he is a person of great contradiction. And this contradiction really runs through almost everything he does. Just to give you a little bit of background on him, Kiesler was never really trained as an architect. He worked in Vienna, or he went to school in Vienna. He never really finished his degree. And then World War I happened, and we don't really know exactly what he was doing for a while. And then in the early 1920s, he was living in Vienna and painting and kind of spending a lot of time with other artists. And he went to Berlin and somehow got this commission to design the setting for Karel Čapek's RUR, which was really his big break into the world of design. There's no indication that he ever before had considered or done anything in the realm of three-dimensional spatial design. So he obviously had some charismatic way about him. And at this point, he didn't really, I think of himself as an architect. He certainly didn't present himself to the world in that way. It wasn't until 1925 when he was working on an exhibition design at the 1925 exhibition of decorative industrial arts in Paris that we get the first glimmerings of him referring to himself in any public sense as an architect. And by this time, he's in his 30s. So here's a man who has made a big career move at a somewhat later time than one would think. And he meets lots of wonderful people in France and Paris, and then he is able to come here to New York in 1929 to not work in architecture, but to curate an exhibition of theatrical design. He, at least in newspaper accounts of the time, still is not really being referred to as an architect, but primarily as a set designer. But he sees being in New York as an opportunity, I think, to transform himself and make himself into what he eventually desires to be, which is someone who works primarily with the medium of space. He does many small projects after this with, I think, at least through the 20s and 30s, kind of no clear trajectory as to what he is really trying to accomplish. But he does really start thinking much more about architecture. And it's during this time that we start to get these projects that are kind of proto-versions, potentially, of the Endless House, such as his 1933 Space House project, which is in itself a wonderful architecture of contradictions, in that it is supposed to be a model home, and a rather fascinating model home with movable interior partitions, seclusion chambers, and things that are supposed to operate on one's psyche. He wants the house to supposedly be malleable in a way for anyone who wants to have their house configured in a particular way. It can be redesigned for them. But at the same time, he wants this house to be mass produced. So on the one hand, we have a house made strictly or conceptualized strictly for the individual, but then somehow is also keyed into the consumer economy of the United States as a solution for the housing ills of the Depression. These things don't quite match up. And And interestingly, the model house itself is not really even a piece of architecture in the sense that it is an exterior building, but rather it's an interior design for a shop. Kiesler's a person who tends to, over time, really focus most of his activity on interior architecture as opposed to exterior architecture. And I think that's actually one really key way in which we have to understand the Endless House. He is an architect who is working from the inside out, as opposed from really even giving any thought at all to things like facade design or even siding to any great extent. But one of the things that I find particularly fascinating about him, really at a more theoretical level, is on the one hand, if you read his work, and he wrote a lot, he wrote all the time. I think he probably wrote more than he designed a lot of the time. And you know, you're lucky as if you're a researcher and you have an architect who actually spends a lot of time writing, because most don't. But on the one hand, when he writes, you know, it could be from the mouth of Hannes Meyer, this techno-functionalist kind of science economy. We need to make houses from observed human behavior. We need to do time motion studies of people going through their houses. We need to do ergonomic studies to determine the proper measures for interior spaces and rooms. So this very kind of you know, much more hard-nosed material. But then on the other hand, and simultaneously, he wants to try to create architecture that is intuitive and purely based on sensory experience. It's almost like there are two different architects inhabiting the body of Frederick Kiesler at times because of this great divide in his writings. And you know, I think that he thought both things. I think that some mornings he woke up and he thought, well, if we do enough research, we can design extremely functional architecture that makes people feel good and feel happy. And perhaps other mornings he woke up and he thought more along the lines of that architecture should really be focused much more on feel and even more esoteric and spiritual concerns and issues of psychology and the psyche. So there are both aims. And I think that perhaps one of the reasons that he continues to be fascinating to researchers and architects alike is because of both of these directions. You know, he wants to do everything. And I think in that way he offers a sort of a touchstone, or as Hani mentioned, a challenge, an inspiration for practitioners now. Is there any way to reconcile the techno-functional with the intuitive and the spiritual? I mean, I think that that's perhaps what many architects continue to strive for. So.
Well, thank you very much for this first round. This was kind of overwhelming. But what it comes really down to is that we all obviously agree on Frederick Kiesler being one of a very poetic and sensitive artist, architect, and within his legacy, we find such a broad theory that gives us a certain view, not only to his very historical point when he developed these things. And so the key question, as you just mentioned, is probably how do we as teachers and how do we in education, and I understand curating is education as well, adapt these things in nowadays language and nowadays perspectives in all these things that we're dealing on today in schools, in the practice. If we admire this so much, so do we really adapt to that? Is that a topic for you at Columbia?
It was his topic at Columbia, right? So he ran his laboratory of design Surrealism, you know, in those just in the war years, just before and during the war, and it was explicitly set up as a sort of a research studio. And if you look at the way he operated and the way he made the students work, and even the kind of product that they produced in terms of, if we can say that, in terms of research and also in objects. It looks exactly like, the description of this is exactly what every young architectural teacher says that they're doing, that they're working collaboratively on research. They're not trying to directly solve what a client would ask them, but they're trying to reinvent the conditions under which, So the idea of the research studio and so on, so you could say you don't even have to know about Kiesler. There is this effect. It was during those years also that the concept of Surrealism is sort of ambiguously going backwards and forwards between Kiesler and the group around Shelter, the Structural Associates, and so on. So it's also a very formative thing for him. But I'm not answering your question very well, but I think it's, and we could turn into a pretty ordinary panel in the sense that we seem to be liking him so much and all of that.
Don't.
But I was going to add to the likes. I mean, because it's Kiesler is very annoying to people who really like him and the people who really hate him. That's an interesting gift, right? To annoy the people that like you. So there's a sort of irritating aspect to Kiesler. One thing that's annoying about him is he's really good, and that's always frustrating, especially if it's a friend. So that's a good example of how somebody you like can annoy you, by being really good. Again, an example of being really good. His reinvention of how a gallery space could operate in relationship to Guggenheim, things like this. So just a fundamental reassessment and rejection of the idea of somebody visiting a gallery and being an isolated observer of an isolated object, trying to imagine a gallery which would, as it were, force a kind of confusion of the viewer and the object, and you would be being looked at by the room just as much as you, and producing a pretty stunning room. So if you want to make a history of architects who've made projects that sort of foreground perception and the complexity of perception and the status of a subject, you're going to put that in there, but you're going to have to put maybe 5 or 6 different projects of Kiesler in. That's super annoying, right? If you think about it, but what was at stake in all of those projects, and was continued to be at stake in the Anzus house, and maybe is best encapsulated by the vision machine that he's doing while at Columbia during that time. In other words, while he's teaching the students, he's also going through an enormous conceptual change. He's trying to actually draw the architecture of subjectivity of the subject in these kind of excruciatingly weird drawings of the inside and the outside, with the psyche, as it were, becoming physical. And, of course, in the age of the selfie, none of this is really that interesting, because the entire world now wants to see itself from outside, right? So you now photograph yourself from outside yourself as a kind of out-of-body experience, so you see yourself embedded in the environment. The weirdness of the selfie is already in the Kiesler thing, where you put your inside on the outside and then you look at your own inside. Like imagine being, talk about an out-of-body experience. What about being out of body in your own autopsy, right? Which presumably happens because you're just still there, still hanging around the hospital room. Those how those drawings look. They look like looking at your insides becoming outsides, right? And then you go back to the surrealist exhibitions. You go back to the shop windows. You go into the book on advertising and shop display. If you consistently look at it, it's actually always exploring the same thing. So in terms of teaching, I think it is a very strong example of a relentlessly obsessive investigation, of a life devoted to that, in which failure, I know I'm repeating the same point of before, but failure to persuade people to actually build what you're doing is crucial to continuing this kind of work. And either you develop an incredible gift of sabotaging, of sort of kamikaze behavior, and he clearly was very gifted in that area, but you have to also achieve a certain number of things that are totally stunning, like the city in space thing from that 25. It's unbelievably beautiful, and any architect would want to have done it. The original robot stage set, it's interesting, I was thinking when you were saying, it is kind of flat in a way. So it's true that he's not yet three-dimensional, but it's good. The cinema, in which it's an eyeball looking at you, again, such a, you go not to look at the cinema, you go to be looked at by the cinema. So just an absolute consistency and sort of relentless behavior. And I think that's a great and almost one would say uplifting model of just a relentless investigation. And I think that annoying, irritating personality was very attractive to complicated creatures like Duchamp, who for whom, Kiesler would even sneak back into the house to draw when the people were. I mean, it's unbelievable, the nature of that relationship. But I think it comes also from the irritating thing. So to conclude this long speech, being really annoying is also clearly an asset. And if you've ever met somebody that's really accomplished a lot, they tend to be pretty annoying types. And he was that. The difference is he was like small, like in every sense. There was, you want to take care of him, it seems to me. So if you look at the relationship of Philip Johnson to Kiesler, it's extremely interesting. Johnson somehow wants to take care. So he has this, Kiesler has an ability to make you want to care and help him while being totally pissed off with what he's doing. And I just, again, I think it's good to talk to students kind of honestly about just how pathetic we all are as creatures, because then they can actually relax a little bit into their own world. This is a super long way of not answering your question. But a good book, you just give the book to the students and they make they invent something out of that. It's not for us to say what that would be.
I just wanted to mention the idea of wanting to help him. I unfortunately sometimes think, well, this panel, we're all here trying to still help him. But you do have these moments, even when you're reading through his personal correspondence, where he's writing to a friend and he says, well, so this fellow, Walter Ahrensberg, famous collector, wants me to design a house for him in California. But I said no, because I don't think he'll do what I want him to. And you just want to tell him, just do it. Come on, just do it this one time. Things might have taken a different turn for you had you done that commission. So it's there is a sense in which I think people who are interested in Kiesler and work on Kiesler, and we're always trying to say, he was good. He really was good. He was an important figure, and keep saving him from himself, perhaps.
I mean, one of the things that we discussed while doing that book is somehow it appears that theory is going back in time pretty much. So Koolhaas is doing elements, and you're doing about Bucky Fuller, and we're doing about Kiesler, and there's a lot of people going again on Le Corbusier, and which is somehow interesting for the last 15 years that we, especially in university, have witnessed enormous steps towards this parametric design and all these computer-related design methods, and there's a strange lack of theory, as I understand it, because there's Patrick Schumacher doing his autopoiesis, and obviously there's a certain need to go back in time, strangely, again, to find some sources that would somehow establish a certain understanding of what we're doing formally. And this is something that we thought it's quite nice to have this book as to show even the students, listen, you're so good with this whatever 3D program you're using, there's someone who already did these shapes based on a certain theory, based on a really deep understanding and working decades on his magic architecture and surrealism. So again, how would you think, as teachers and as people working in the field, how could we adapt, and how could we somehow establish an understanding of what was there and is now being treated as to be important in a certain sense in the contemporary discourse of architecture? Because we all know it's not happening. Kiesler is not happening outside, whether it's here or there. It's a certain difference in how the world looks today, especially when it comes around construction sites here in New York. It is not like that. Absolutely not. It is very, very, very odd and probably boring, but big production.
Yeah, well, yeah, maybe happening. Well,
No, I was just going to say I wish the book had been around when I was teaching in the Glasgow School of Art, which I had the privilege to teach there. And actually Kiesler did feature on a course I taught about the domestic landscape. And one of the beauties of working in that wonderful institution was the ability to teach architects, designers, environmental artists together. And I think in that sense, you know, Kiesler needs that kind of generalist education, which isn't necessarily available.
I mean, I agree. Of course, your question's kind of impossible. Who knows what the answer to that is? But some thoughts. One is that I mean, architects don't listen to each other very much. And if we talk about how difficult it was for Kiesler and, you know, being sort of simultaneously attractive and repulsive, that's also true in general for, let's say, architects as a species that are not so much loved by society and have very beautiful ideas and so much want to help and to offer and are treated as dealing with an expensive form of magic. That art is now fully understood what it is, and it's all part of the market. And you know, art schools now look like what architecture schools used to look like, and architecture schools now look like art schools because everybody knows the architect is literally poor, not just conceptually, but actually poor and struggling. And what that does, it tends to toughen the architect up, and so architects fight for everything, and they fight with each other, and so they cannot afford to listen to each other. They become all of them like looking for their audience share. But architects listen a lot to dead architects. And perhaps, and you know, so while two architects in a room never will listen to each other, and they're like looking for the angle to kind of take the other one down, they're very, very sensitive to the architects of the past, and they might even see they might want the approval of architects of the past. So I think there are many architects today who would like Kiesler's approval. And they recognize it, and that would be the first point. The second point would be, actually a lot of what Kiesler was talking about is very much alive today, not in architecture, but in almost every other aspect of our life. We are really trying to understand what is the situation of our body. Everybody's obsessed with the health of the psyche, the body. The technologies that we use have blurred the limits of our being. So we find ourselves, all of us, asking very existential questions. And then we look back for architects that have really given some thought to that. And Kiesler pops up. I thought Hani's image of the lighthouse was a very beautiful image of that situation where you need sometimes. So I just think there's a reason for that. And the third thing is, of course, it's just so funny that when the so-called digital generation began, they knew nothing about Kiesler, but they were doing Kiesler and saying, but this is only possible because of the computer. And I remember Ben van Berkel's Moebius project in some biennale somewhere. And those of us of the historian bent teased him enormously about this was just Kiesler. And so there is, and so there's a relationship between that the technologies of today that are computational and have blurred a lot of our thinking, and even 3D printing and so on, there's a reason why the kinds of forms that Kiesler was working with are kind of diagrams of this fluidity. So I think it was not an accident that the digital generation started reproducing Kiesler without knowing about it. I think it's almost honorable that they didn't know about it. And then they've become very curious and very sophisticated. And that's also another aspect I like about the book, actually trying to figure out digitally what was Kiesler about. So it's a long answer to your question, but I think it's talking with the dead is often more informative than talking to people that are alive.
Yeah, well, I mean, I deal with young architecture students on a daily basis, and most of them are young enough that they haven't yet come in contact with Kiesler. I try to introduce them sometimes if I think they're ready for it. But I think that one of the appealing things for those who are aware of him is he gives them a sense of substance to some of the ideas that they might have floating around that they're not sure if it's okay to say. I had one student last year who designed purely in model. And I mean, of course, that's a method of a lot of students, but I said, hey, that's great, you know, because you're getting a better sense of how spatial forms are interacting by kind of putting yourself in your model. She was just a sophomore, so really had just started doing this. And she said, well, I'm not really sure if this is okay because a lot of my colleagues here are working with plans, they're doing elevations and sections. And I said, well, hey, here's this guy who you might be interested in. He designed only in Model 2, and actually he built models that he could get inside of in order to get a sense of what it felt like to exist in them. And she kind of took a moment and it all gelled. It made sense that this was a valid way of working. And I think that Kiesler is nice in that he gives people who might otherwise not be sure if there is one correct way to work or not, a sense that however they want to work, particularly if it is from this intuitive sense of the body, it's okay to do that. You don't have to just draw all the time. You can actually also build. You know, I just wanted to comment on something that Florian mentioned in terms of parametrics making all of these forms possible, and then potentially in Kiesler finding a justification for them. I would be very cautious with such an idea because I don't think Kiesler was actually necessarily interested in the formal qualities of a form. I think he was much more interested in what would actually potentially transpire inside that form. And the form that it took was a result of many, many factors that went on within its generation. So making an interesting biomorphic shape was not the point. The biomorphic shape came from a constellation of forces, as he would probably say, or energies. Patrick Schumacher's sort of interesting because in his parametricist manifesto, he actually discusses this exactly. I mean, Kiesler could have written parts of it with having these concentrations of energy that kind of move out and create spatial forms. So I think that Kiesler can be a nice lineage for parametric design, but I think that one has to keep in mind that Kiesler was not starting with the shapes themselves. He was not taking a shape and then injecting it with something. The shapes came from something deeper within.
I mean, I would agree. I would agree with that completely. I mean, I think that one of the things that's interesting is, to use again my analogy of resistance, is that you can't teach Kiesler. You can't sort of sit down and tell students to, in fact, to tell you the truth, the Endless House is absolutely uncopyable. It's impossible to emulate. Everything that you try and do that even looks remotely like it is an aberration and kind of and wrong. I think the other thing about Kiesler that's so fascinating, and it's something that I'm kind of happy to, I mean, it's an interesting problem in that he was against, in a way, although he might have wanted to be, the cult of celebrity. You know, here's a guy who, as you said, was small. here's a guy who I understand was in a bad mood all the time. He wasn't particularly good with his press or his, I mean, he didn't sort of fall into that. And I think that's what's given Kiesler as a phenomena the longevity and the power to continue past this phase. I remember when I first started teaching the digital studios at Columbia, when we brought the computers in back in the 90s, in the last century, I remember the resistance that I received as a teacher when my students wanted to do work that was basically just entirely based on virtual reality and inside-out kind of phenomena, with all that VR stuff I did. There was another teacher, a close friend of mine, who also teaches at the Angewandte, Greg, who was doing the opposite in a way, was doing the form-driven work. I think it's interesting to see, even in that short history, the last couple of decades, the let's say the penchant and the kind of attraction of the image as a commodifiable, repeatable entity, as a thing, as opposed to the other route, which Kiesler took, passionately, which is against reproduction, against emulation, against copy. Forces you, if you are going to study Kiesler, as you said, you have to read a lot, as opposed to just trace drawings or try and get the style. And I think that's the power of the Kiesler phenomena, more so than the man. Is that, and in this day and age of the selfie, of the sort of deifying of the cult figures of celebrity, it's kind of refreshing that the lighthouse is kind of spun around again and is beaming on us for a few seconds here until it spins out. Time for Gerd.
So let's keep it with the lighthouse now. Thank you very much. And I'd ask Gerd to do a brief summary, final note on that. We'd be happy to have that. Thank you.
Yeah, it's now very an ambitious task for me to catch up the many aspects that were during the discussion. The lighthouse is a very good figure as light. The design by light was for Kiesler very important, and the lighting of the building, and also the use of photography, in fact the medium of light, to mediate his ideas of architecture. If you visit the exhibition, you just see the series of drawings that were done by Kiesler for illustrating an article that he was writing on the endless house and its psychological lighting. So the lighthouse and the spinning light really is a good figure to catch up Kiesler, and also this resistance, the resistance of accommodating to a taste, to the taste of time, to the needs of economics. I just want to give here one phrase of Kiesler, to quote him: "I believe that everybody has only one basic creative idea, and no matter how he's driven off, you will find that he will always come back to it until he has a chance to prove it in purity or die with the idea unrealized." So although Kiesler sometimes really got close to getting his projects realized, he always resisted to it. It was with the Endless House, after his very successful contribution to the visionary architecture, which was in a kind of recompensation for not having built it here in the sculpture garden, a lot of coverage of this exhibition was illustrated by photographs of the model of the Endless House. And here it comes to a second point that was mentioned in this discussion, the conflict of the interior and the exterior, the inside out, or the being inside, a notion that was very important for Kiesler. He even titled his autobiographical, his autobiography like inside the endless house. So this notion of being inside really was important, and it was really a pleasure to hear it now in the panel, that not I as an archivist of the foundation working with a lot of texts of Kiesler really realizes that this importance of the inside. And the Kiesler himself, he gave a lecture on teaching in the art schools, which he entitled the teaching of resistance. So it was not only resisting to having his project built, but also it was important for him to transport and to mediate this aspect to his students. I think the endless house still is so fascinating because, of course, it's endless not because only of the shape, but also as a project, as an open artwork. So it gives us a nearly endless opportunity to project our ideas into it, but also Kiesler never finished it. So when he came close to building it in 1961 in Florida, well, in effect, they didn't build it, but it was not. He even shot one of his drawings that he did for the project. He put it on a brush, and then he shot it with a shotgun. But so he shot his project, but it was not over. So he continued it with in the fields of sculpture, as he was turning to mythology, sculpting the horse of Alexander the Great. And if you look at this sculpture, it really looks like a smaller version of an endless house. So to close now is, I really love what you said, Mark, of this, that the project gets a creature, that the architect tries to ride on. As Jean Arp called the endless house, or the architecture of Kiesler, the egg of the egg. So if you look at the small model here in the exhibition, this spheroid egg-shaped, nearly perfect object, I think we even can't imagine how it would have been if the creature would have cracked the shell and came out. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. To continue this interesting discussion inside yourself, you should take the book with you, and before doing that, the university and the Austrian Cultural Forum in New York invite you to a reception outside. Thank you for coming.